Testing. Hello? Yeah. Is that better? Okay, so I'm going to start. It's 12 o'clock now. And I'm going to be talking about JavaScript charting using YUI Flot. Who here is a JavaScript programmer? Okay. What is your interest in this talk? Everyone? Who's here just because they're curious? Cool. Okay. This is who I am. My name is Philip Tellis. That's a very dark picture of me, and that's how you can reach me. I work at Yahoo. I'm a geek. I've been an open source developer for over 10 years. And I'm Blues Moon on Twitter and most social networks. So, charting. What's this talk all about? Charting options for web developers, primarily JavaScript-based charting, because that's what I do. JavaScript charting with YUI Flot. What I learned while building this, and how you can contribute to the project. Okay. Who here contributes to an open source project? Cool. What kind of projects? Who does it on the front end?
Good ones only.
Good ones. Okay, so why do you need charting on the web? For me, that's the way I deliver content to my users. Okay, my users are actually all internal to Yahoo, but I deliver content to them using the web because so much of the infrastructure already built for me. I don't have to go and build a window and several widgets and stuff. It's all there. I just use HTML. The data I need is also on the web. It's easy for me to send users to a particular page. I just send them a URL, they get it. And if I find a bug there, I can fix it without actually having to send them a new URL. So they get that data out. And it's a little more portable than my manager sending me an Excel spreadsheet that I can't open. So that's why I get charts on the web. Now, what are the alternatives to doing charting on the web? So initially, I used to use static images. So there are several libraries depending on what language you want to use. So PHP has a bunch of libraries. What programming languages do people use on the back end? JavaScript on the back end. Python? Java? Anybody does CGI scripts in C and C++? Yes. Okay, so regardless of what language you use, there is a charting library on the back end. And if there isn't, use Google Charts, hit the REST API, pull down the PNG, and serve it to your users so that Google doesn't figure out your referrer. Okay, that's what I do. There's Flash-based dynamic charts. So the thing with static images is they're static, right? The user sees the chart, they can download that image, email it to each other, but they can't really interact with it. They can't drill down into the data, they can't roll up and stuff like that. So you move to dynamic charts, which is one of the options is Flash, which can pull data from the server in real time and change the chart. It can do funky things like animate your chart, and managers really like it. But I don't, for several reasons. One was, well, I develop primarily on Linux, and every time I use Flash, it grabs the focus of my page, so I'm hitting tab and nothing's happening. So that was one reason. The bigger reason is that if I need to change something, I don't like, I want to add a feature to the chart, I can't actually go into the Flash and change that because I don't know how to write code in Flash. But I know JavaScript, so that was the third option I looked at. And actually, this is how I actually progressed and got into JavaScript charting. So JavaScript with Canvas. So by default, JavaScript can't really draw things, but once you add in the Canvas tag, which all really cool browsers support, you can draw pretty lines, and lines go on to give you charts. So you can do that. A couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine, a colleague at Yahoo, Christian Heilmann, developed CSS-only charts. So he draws bar charts using CSS. They work well for him. I don't do that stuff. And many years ago, back in the early 2000s, I used to draw charts using HTML tables and set the background color of the cell and cell height and stuff like that. So don't do that anymore. Image-based charts. So many charting libraries kind of works in all browsers. If you have a text-based browser, you can still download the image and view it offline or something. It's probably not accessible, but when we're dealing with charts, we need to make alternate arrangements for making the data available. You can't easily interact with the data, things I've already mentioned. So Flash is pretty. Works on most GUI-based browsers with the plugin. The problem with the plugin is also most instability with browsers is because of plugins. It doesn't work on the iPhone, last I heard. Does anyone know if that's changed? There is that JavaScript-based Flash runtime, which could make it possible. Yeah, Gordon. So it may work, I don't know, but last I heard it doesn't work on the iPhone, which for many people is a big downside. Grabs the focus, which for me is the big problem. Flash on its own is fast, but when you want to interact with it through JavaScript, there's that Flash to JavaScript bridge, which is can be slow, especially when you're doing two-way interaction. So for example, you want to attach a JavaScript-based event handler to a Flash event. That's really slow. And another cool thing is you can progressively enhance a data table. So you have data in an HTML table. You can tell your Flash to read the data out of that using some kind of toolkit. JavaScript-based charting libraries. So it's easy for any JavaScript developer to hack. I think that there are more JavaScript developers than Flash developers. I don't have exact numbers on that, but based on whatever I've seen across various conferences and discussion lists, it seems to be the case. It's based on open standards, so the canvas element is now part of the HTML5 specification. JavaScript already has is part of the ECMA specification. It doesn't natively work with Internet Explorer, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But you can get it to work with using the EX Canvas library. So if you really need to support Internet Explorer, you have an option available to you. It's easy to integrate with other JavaScript libraries. So if you're using Dojo, or you're using jQuery, you're using YUI or MooTools, that's already JavaScript. You have your data in JavaScript in a JavaScript data structure. It's easy to dump it into a JavaScript-based charting library. And again, it can progressively enhance a data table using whatever kind of data accessor your library provides you. CSS-only charts. I don't have internet access here, or I'd show you that, but that's a URL you can go to if you want to see what it looks like. Yeah, icant.co.uk CSS charts. Very simple code. It's a list item and CSS to enhance that into a chart. The thing is, your data needs to be encoded twice, once in the actual data that you display and the other in the style sheet. And currently, he only supports vertical bar charts. I think he could do horizontal bar charts too, but I don't think anything else. I'm sure creative people can figure out how to do polygons with divs and borders and stuff. Then you may as well write Doom, right? So what is Flot? Has anyone heard of Flot before? 1, 2, 3, 4. Does anyone here work on Flot? No? All right. So Flot is this charting library written for jQuery. It's really cool. It's pretty, which is what we all like Flash for, but it doesn't have any of those downsides of Flash. Right? It was developed by a company named IOLA. I forget what IOLA stands for. And it's released under an MIT license, which is pretty free. Uses the HTML canvas tag for drawing charts. It's really smooth, very pretty, and uses EX Canvas to work on Internet Explorer. So if I remember correctly, it currently supports Firefox versions 2 and above, Internet Explorer versions 6 and above, Opera and Safari, and Conqueror. Yes, those are the 5 browsers that are listed on its homepage. So YUI Flot also supports all of those. So why did I like it? It looks good, and since my primary use of charts is to get other people, mainly managers in my company, to look at performance-related data, I need a nice way to make them interested in that data, so that they say, okay, here's some more money, and go and improve your performance. So I need my charts to look pretty, otherwise they'll never look at them. It has a good event model, so when you do things interacting with the chart, it fires events that you can then attach your own handlers to and react to that. It's fast at drawing and redrawing, so something that I didn't see before, but you can draw a chart and then redraw the whole chart, and it's almost instantaneous, except on Internet Explorer. And Flot has this ability to zoom into sections, so it has a selection model. You can select a subsection of the graph and then zoom into that subsection. You need to do things through events, but there's example code that does it, and it's like 3 or 4 lines of code, and you can do that, which again is important if you want to drill down into the data. And that's something I could not do in any of the Flash-based libraries that I looked at. So why did I port it to YUI? Now, I work at Yahoo. I've been using YUI before it was released to the public, so it's pretty much hard-coded into my brain. I know how to write code in YUI, and when I write a JavaScript, when I work on JavaScript, the first library I pick is YUI. So when I needed a charting widget, I was looking around. YUI charts is obviously available, but I had problems with that because of the Flash. I used it for a few months and then decided to look at something else. So Flot was available. It had a very good community. So if you look at it's on Google Code, and you can look at the forums, and there's a lot of discussions, many people sending in patches and stuff. So that was something I liked about it, and I realized even if Flot itself didn't have a feature I needed, somebody would have written a plugin or written a patch for it that I could then import. And since I was already working with JavaScript and I knew JavaScript, I'm not a JavaScript expert, but I knew some amount of JavaScript, so I could take a JavaScript library, and if I needed to fix something, I could go into the code and figure it out and change things. So that's why I picked Flot and why I ported it to YUI. So what can we do? Section 2. Well, you can do a bunch of things. I'm not going to look at all of them. I can show you some of the examples that we have. Random scatter plots. Now, if you look at that data set there, it's not in order. So there's random points that are just in any kind of order. And it'll plot it on a chart. It doesn't draw lines between it, so you won't go like zigzagging through the chart. But you will get nice points. And these are useful if you want to see where your data is clustered. So if you have like 10,000, 30,000 points, it actually is fairly comfortable drawing that many points on the chart, and you get a good idea of where things are. Now, when you get to too many points, you have an obvious limitation. If your screen width is 1,024 pixels and you want to draw 2,000 points, each point is going to be half a pixel wide, right? And you can't plot half a pixel. So one of the things I did with YUI Flot was try to figure out what's the optimum number of points that can fit in and drop points in between those. So it works sort of, but when you're drawing scatter plots, since you don't actually have a linear progression, you don't always want to drop points. So there's an option in there to turn that off. You can draw a simple series. So the best example of a series is a time series, where your x-axis is increasing in constant steps. So in this case, it's 1 day at a time, and your y-axis could be anything. Thing about what I added to YUI Flot is it doesn't just take in timestamps, it can also take in date objects and plot your x-axis based on that. Resolution is in seconds, unlike in Flot, which is in milliseconds. And the reason I did that was most backend languages, if you use the time function, they'll give you out a Unix timestamp in seconds and not in milliseconds. So rather than have to iterate through the data and multiply everything by 1,000 before I pass it to the library, I just let the library handle it in seconds. And full strf time based formatting. So you can actually, that y-axis, you can plot something using any strf time based formatter. So I can show you an example. Time series. So this is the chart that I have, and you see the y-axis there. Can everyone see this code here? So that's a time format string. I can change that to anything else. So let's say y_j. And if I refresh that, it doesn't work. I know why. I don't have internet access. Yeah, so unfortunately I need to connect to yahooapis.com, so we're not going to see examples, sorry. But yeah, these examples are all linked from the slides, so if you go to my slides and you click on that, you'll get it. The slides I'll put up on SlideShare as soon as the talk is over, so once I get back to the main building, I'll put it up on SlideShare. Let's go ahead. So you can also do multiple series using a common x-axis. So many times what I find is, so in the data that I look at, I'll have multiple dimensions and a single control point. So for example, the date is the same across all my data, but I have different types of data that I need to plot against that date. So it's when you select it out of the database, what you get is a single row with one date column and all your other columns that need to be plotted. So it makes it really helpful if you can just pass this data structure that you get out of SQL, pass it straight to the charting library and get it to draw a chart. So that's exactly what this does. It lets you take a schema and say, okay, I've got, this is my x axis and the rest of these are my y points. So go ahead and plot it, and Flot will figure that out for you. So an example of what this data looks like. So we have a common x over there, and y is different. It does some intelligent things. It tries, if you just pass it a data structure, it'll try and figure out which is your x-axis and which is your y-axis. So it looks for common things like if you have a field name x, then it takes that as the x-axis. If you have a field name time or date, it takes that as the x-axis. If it can't figure that out, it'll take the first point as the x-axis and the rest of them as the y-axis. Or it'll let you specify which one is your x-axis and which one's your y-axis. What that means is you can pass 20 different dimensions and say only plot these 4, right? And it would do that as well. So how do you use it? And how am I doing on time? Okay. So you first create a div. You can create any HTML element, any block level element that you put onto your page where you want the chart to go, and give it an ID. The ID can be anything, it just needs to be unique on the page. So I've given something like div ID equals placeholder. And then include your JavaScript. So the first thing you do is include EXCanvas if you're using Internet Explorer. So that's a conditional include that's supported only by Internet Explorer, which means that code looks like a comment to all other browsers. It looks like an include to IE. Then include the JavaScript. So you first include the YUI library. You need actually only, so depending on what kind of chart you need, you may actually need less than this data. So the Yahoo DOM event part is all that you need to draw charts. If you want to do time series, then you also need the data source, which includes the strf time-based formatter. The two of these together are pretty small. I did not actually check the byte size of it, but it is fairly small. And once you've done that, include YUI Flot. as of today, you probably need to download this code and include it on your own server, but I'm probably going to push it into the YUI gallery soon, so that should also be available through the combo handler, yeah?
Is that valid for the X canvas as well?
Okay, the question is this URL valid for EX Canvas? So I know EX Canvas is available on Google's CDN. It's not, as far as I know, it's not available on Yahoo CDN. So you could link to it from Google CDN or put it on your own server. Yeah, I would not recommend combining EX Canvas and YUI Flot because you don't want all your other users to have to download all of EX Canvas when they don't need it. Right. So that's pretty much all you need to initialize the data. And to initialize the chart. Now you need to get some data. So you could get your data from a static array, or you could get it using a data source. So in YUI, we have a data source object that can pull data from various sources. It could be a URL, it could be a static array, it could be a function that returns the array, it could be an HTML table that gives you the array. If it's a URL, that data could be in XML or in JSON or in CSV format. So there's really a whole bunch of formats that you can get your data in and pass it to the chart. So once you do that, you need to pass it to the chart. Sorry, you need to configure your chart. So Flot, so not just YUI Flot, but Flot on its own has really good defaults. So you could actually not configure it at all and have a really good looking chart. The default is to have lines on and points off, but sometimes I also like to have lines and points together. So use lines show true, points show true, which means it will show you lines as well as points. You could also say bars true, in which case it will turn off lines and points and draw a bar chart. And then initialize it. So Yahoo widget Flot, you just call it as a function, Yahoo widget Flot, give it the ID of the div that you want to draw it into. The data needs to be in an array, and I'll explain that in a second. And the config object. And the config object is optional, so if you don't want to put that in, just leave it out and it'll do a default. Now, why do we put the data in an array? The reason is that Flot can take in multiple data arrays and plot all of them on the same chart. So you could have data one from your first data source, like in looking at performance data, I could get one data source which is reading out my hard disk performance and another one that's reading out my network performance, and plot them both on the same chart, and possibly even give them different axes because the units are different and the scales are different. Okay. Does anyone know what the problems with plotting multiple data dimensions on the same chart is? Probably done it in school with pen and paper, right? So your two data may be of different scales. That's one problem, in that you might be measuring one thing in GBps and another thing in kbps. If you plot them on the same chart, your kbps will be along the x-axis. So you need to scale them differently. Secondly is if you have too many dimensions, your chart just has too many lines, and eventually you run out of colors that look nice. So colors is actually a pretty hard thing because you need to pick colors that are visible to everyone. There's people who can't see certain color, can't see the difference between certain color choices. So the cool thing about Flot is that, again, it picks good defaults. So if you just let Flot pick it, it'll pick your first 4 or first 5 colors will be pretty good. So what are the changes I made in YUI Flot? So apart from actually changing every call to jQuery to a call to YUI, and sometimes I had to rewrite some of jQuery functionality in YUI because YUI did not have that functionality. So it was actually really simple to change it. There were maybe like 4 or 5 lines of code where Flot was actually referring to jQuery, and I had to change those. Well, I said not lines, but 4 or 5 different types of calls that I had to change. So it was simple to just do a global search and replace on the code and then run through all the lines that were replaced to verify. And it was based off Flot 0.5, which was released sometime last year. Flot 0.6 was released at the end of last year, so November or December, I don't remember, which they added a few new features that I find pretty cool, but they're not in YUI Flot. One thing I added was logarithmic scales. So Flot itself only had linear scales, both x and y axes were only linear. I added logarithmic scales to all axes, which is actually more than what Flot has. So Flot has 2 axes on each side, so you can have 2 x-axes and 2 y-axes. YUI Flot can have an unlimited number of axes on any direction. It doesn't draw all of them, so you can only draw 2, but you can have an infinite number of scales. Again, infinite depending on the resources you have to actually draw it on, to actually store that in memory. Right? So, and the reason I added that was because I've worked with 4-dimensional data, which is of different scales and needs to be scaled differently on the same chart. So we have more than 2 axes in each direction, all of which can support linear as well as logarithmic scales. So you can plot linear data and log data on the same chart. It's not advisable because it thoroughly confuses your users. Another cool thing I added was axis labels. I did not add this myself. Well, I added the code myself, but it's based on something I saw in someone else's implementation of Flot, where labels itself is just putting your numbers below the axis and on the left of the y-axis. But you also have an axis label which just says, okay, this axis is about this data right at the bottom. Not sure if the diagram has, it's only after. Yeah, so if you look at this, you'll see a number at the bottom there. And that's the x-axis label and series on the left over there, which is the y-axis label. So that's something that was added, axis labels. Point dropping, which I already told you about. So if you have too many points on a plot, it'll try and drop them. Now, if you're drawing a line chart, this really works out because if you're drawing lines and points, so it'll still draw the lines where those points should have been, but it just won't draw the circle around the point. So you don't have just like a forest of points on the chart. And most important for me, I changed all the space indentation to tab indentation. Some more things I added. Time series. So the initial time series accepts milliseconds as the data value. I changed that to accept data objects and also use seconds rather than milliseconds. Again, I mentioned it's because I write my backend code in PHP and Perl, both of which will spit out Unix timestamp in seconds. Rather than have to iterate through my data and change that all, I just like send the data straight to the chart and not have anything in between. Full STRF time-based date formatter. So Flot itself has an intelligent date formatter, but it's not based on STRF time. It's based on a subset of STRF time. This was actually another pet project of mine. So when I was working with the Flash-based charting library, I didn't like the way it was formatting dates, so I went and implemented STRF time in JavaScript and released it under BSD license, which then YUI decided it was good enough to put into YUI, so it's now part of the YUI library. So now since YUI had STRF time that I had written a few months before, I decided, hey, I'm going to use it in every charting library that I work on. So it's part of this as well. And the thing I did with the STRF time library was it's fully internationalized. So you can actually print a date in any locale in the world. Okay? Except I don't know every single language in the world, so I did not implement the dates in every language in the world. But it's like 3 lines of code to add your own locale, and then you can plot chart with your axis in I don't know, French or German or Korean or Bulgarian or Swedish or anything you want. I don't know how it works in right to left languages. Okay. So things I'm looking at in the future. Um, First of all, move up to Flot 0.6. So there's some new features. 0.6 has a plugin-based model. So if jQuery itself has a plugin-based model and Flot is one of those plugins for jQuery, Flot itself designed a plugin model, so now you can define plugins for a plugin for jQuery. So I like that model. Uh, I like it because it lets other people add code to it without having to modify the library itself, which would make my job easier because I can then pull in some of the Flot plugins and use them directly in YUI Flot without having to change them. Uh, YUI Flot has a thresholds feature. So, for example, think of a finance-based application or chart where you want to plot everything above a certain level as green and everything below it as red. Or even in performance, if everything goes above your SLA needs to be red and everything below your SLA needs to be green. So that's where the threshold feature comes in, where it says, this is my threshold, and everything above it needs to be in this color, and below it needs to be in this color. And it's a pretty useful feature that I'm thinking of adding in. I just can't figure out how I do thresholds for when I have 4 different time series on a chart, because then I need to pick 8 different colors. I have a hard time picking 2. It also has stacked bars, which are useful. I don't have a need for it at the moment, but there could be a need. So stacked bars, basically you have so you have one bar and the next bar goes on top of that. So your data is, you can see like the sum of the data as well as individual data points. And it's useful when you're looking at an overall value. It's kind of similar to an area-based chart where the values add up. So if you're looking at requests per second across 5 different servers, you're primarily interested in what's your total request per second. So you look at the overall chart, but you can also see the size of each band, which tells you more data than just the 2 dimensions of the chart. Stepped line charts are useful. So a stepped line chart is, let's say you have 2 points, one here and one here. Instead of just drawing a straight line between that, it draws one line that way and one line that way. So it's basically a discrete jump. It's not a continuous chart. And it's useful if your data is discrete rather than continuous. Right. Again, I don't have a current use for that, but I can think of people who would. More things I'm looking at. So these are things that are useful for me. So error bars and candlesticks. Again, when dealing with performance data, you can't just say, this is the response time of that page, because it depends on how many measurements you've made and what's the error in that measurement. So you can say, okay, this page has taken 2 seconds to load, plus or minus 0.2 seconds. And you need some way of plotting that plus or minus 0.2 seconds on the same chart. That's where error bars and candlesticks come in. So it's basically you have a point and you draw a line going above it and a line going below it and say, okay, that's my range of data. Or you can do other cool things like shade the chart behind it in a color, a sort of lighter color based on how much error there was on each reading. Adding smoothing plugins. So again, if you take a time series which has, say, 100 data points, they might be pretty jagged. And that doesn't, you don't really need to have that level of information. You just want to see the trend line. Is my performance going up or is it going down? So by adding smoothing to that, which what it does, it takes a moving average. So take the average of 3 points or 5 points and plot that instead of actually plotting the data point. And that gives you a good indication of what's the trend of the data rather than what the actual data is. Finally, upgrade to YUI 3, and once I do that, move it into the YUI gallery, which means then Flot would directly be available through Yahoo CDN, so you can directly access it from there without having to host it on your own server, which will be one less HTTP request, one less DNS lookup. The things I learned, I was no expert JavaScript programmer before this, so the first time I was doing Flot, I did something like what's on the left there. I basically wanted to normalize the data, so I passed in the data structure, did some manipulation on it, and it worked perfectly, right? I was doing stuff. Then I wanted to add more code which used that same data structure later and plotted a data table, and the data was completely different from what I was getting from the server. So it's because it was passed in my reference, and so when I was normalizing the data, I was normalizing the actual original data structure that I had. So internally now, I've changed Flot to work on a copy of the data. What that means is it needs to iterate through all the data once before it can plot it. So that kind of slows it down a bit, especially if you're going to redraw the chart multiple times. But I need to do that anyway in order to check if all your data points are valid. Like sometimes you might have things that are not numbers in there, or you have too many points which need to be dropped. So all those things need to be checked. So I do it in the same loop. There's more to charts than drawing lines. So after I started doing this, I started getting more interested in statistics. So I've spent a lot of time on Wikipedia, which is where I'm learning statistics from. There's also some pretty other interesting sites. One of them I've listed here. So different visualizations for different types of data. And if you go to that white paper, it's a really interesting one about this guy's got a paper of how you visualize different kinds of data. And he's shown like if you have a population chart, rather than just show a bar, if you show it in number of human figures, it's a little more understandable to the person who's reading the chart. So it's once you start getting into this thing of actually designing the user interface to the data, you need to think much more than just drawing lines to present it to the user. You're basically looking at summarizing this data visually. So when a user's looking at a chart, he doesn't want to know the actual numbers. If he wanted to know the numbers, he'd just print out a table and figure that out. He wants to know, is it going up, is it going down, is it green, right? So, and you can plot more than 2 dimensions on a 2-dimensional canvas. So an example is if you take a scatter plot, you can just plot all the points where the x and y coordinates are, or you can plot bigger points at certain places and smaller points at certain places, indicating that this data is more important than this data. And similarly, using error bars, you can have 3 dimensions on that 2-dimensional data. You can rotate HTML elements using Canvas. So if you go back there, look at that series, it's actually printing upwards. I had no idea that was possible until I did this. So this is how you do it to work in all browsers. Mouse transform rotate 270 degrees for Gecko-based browsers. WebKit transform rotate 270 degrees for WebKit-based browsers. And then those 2 lines for Internet Explorer, or you can do this 1 line for Internet Explorer. So yeah, it actually works in everything, including Internet Explorer 6 and above. One caveat though, when you use a filter in Internet Explorer, it tends to execute that filter every time you interact with the page. So with like mouse overs and scrolls and stuff, it's going to run that every time, which kind of makes it slower. I haven't measured the performance of this particular filter at all, so I don't know. So right, those are the things I learned when working on this project. Finally, how do you contribute? So you go to GitHub, the project's on GitHub, github.com/bluesmoon/YUI-Flot. I have the URL at the end. You fork it, make your own changes. You need to put your changes under the BSD license, and tell me about them through a pull request so I can pull them into my own repository. Now, this code is available to everyone, but you need to download it from my repository or your own repository. I mean, you can totally just run your own fork of it and have your own changes and not ever put it back into my main tree. I have no problem with that, and you can distribute it on your own. Okay. If you want to get it into the YUI gallery, which is what I plan on doing, then you need to sign Yahoo YUI CLA. I have a few copies here if anyone's interested in signing today. It basically says that you are legally allowed to commit any code that you actually do commit. So like you haven't stolen it from someone, or SEO doesn't come and sue us sometime. And that makes the code available through the CDN. So you could get your code changes into the Yahoo CDN, which makes it it's a greater chance of it being cached across the internet and better performance through users. So that's the URL. And I have some stickers laptop stickers. In case you were bored with my talk, thank you for sitting through it. But yeah, there's a few people I'd like to thank, Jochen Mason, Philip Pace, how do you pronounce it? Paps, right? Yeah, they contacted me like a couple of weeks ago and helped a lot with getting my visa and stuff, so I wouldn't have been here. The guys who built Flot, yeah, who developed a network, and the YUI team for helping me out with all my development work and stuff. So, I don't know, you want to pass these things around, or do you want to just come down here and pick it up? Yeah, I'll just leave it here. I don't know, some people are lazy, you know. It's down that way, and I don't know, some down this way. Can pass it down. Pass it down there. Yeah. So if you need to contact me, that's my details again. Yeah, questions? Does it support dynamic charts? Kind of. So through the event model, you can do that. The problem is Internet Explorer is, again, really slow with doing the redrawing. So I didn't build it into the library. But it's possible, and I don't have an example yet. I'll publish an example showing how to do it. Right? Yeah. Question. Do I support vertical bars? I don't know. Horizontal bars. So I know it's in Flot. I don't remember if that's a feature that was added after I ported it or before. But in either case, it's going to be in soon. Okay. Others, yeah.
Are you in talks though with the original developers to not keep big vectors, but maybe you can abstract all the jQuery/GUI calls and keep one project?
Okay.
Something you're considering?
So the question is, have I been in touch with the original developers to abstract out the jQuery dependencies and maintain that as one, say, a plugin, and the rest of Flot as its own library? No, I haven't been in touch with them. I might. I haven't thought about it yet. Yeah. So far it was my pet project, and I put it up on GitHub because it was easy to do that. But I have only one person who's ever forked the project so far, so I know there's only one other person using it. But yeah, if there's more interest, then I might get in touch with them and do that. Any other questions? Does anyone else need stickers? You didn't get any? Sorry, I didn't get it. Say that again. Yeah, I didn't look at the Dojo charting library. I looked at GNU Plot. GNU Plot. So GNU Plot has a, y'all didn't get it. So GNU Plot has, it allows you to translate your GNU Plot charts into JavaScript, and it's interesting that way. But no, Flot was the second one I saw, and I liked it immediately. So I kind of stopped my search. Anyone want to sign the CLA? Thank you. Sure.